For most of my marriage, cleaning my husband's car had been one of those small routines I never thought much about. Every few weeks, usually on a quiet Saturday morning, I would take a bucket of water, a few cleaning supplies, and spend an hour making the vehicle look spotless. It wasn't because he asked me to. It was simply something I did. After 28 years of marriage, caring for the things we shared had become second nature to me. That particular Saturday began like any other. The sun was shining through the trees in our front yard, and the neighborhood was peaceful. My husband, Richard, had left early that morning, claiming he needed to meet a client before lunch. I didn't question him. Lately, I had stopped questioning many things. As I opened the car door, a faint, unfamiliar scent drifted toward me. It wasn't strong enough to identify, but it certainly wasn't the smell of Richard's usual aftershave. I paused for a moment before shaking my head. Maybe one of his coworkers had ridden with him recently. There was probably a perfectly reasonable explanation. I started cleaning as usual. I wiped down the dashboard, polished the windows, and removed a collection of receipts from the center console. Most were ordinary: gas stations, coffee shops, hardware stores. But a few caught my attention. They were from places on the other side of town, areas Richard rarely visited. A small knot formed in my stomach. Over the past 6 months, little things had been bothering me. Richard had become strangely protective of his phone. He used to leave it lying around the house without a second thought. Now he carried it everywhere, even to the bathroom. He smiled at messages he never shared. Sometimes he stepped outside to take calls, lowering his voice whenever I approached. Whenever I asked if everything was okay, he always had an answer ready. "Work is stressful. I'm dealing with a difficult client. You're imagining things." Those explanations had sounded reasonable at first, but eventually they began to feel rehearsed. I pushed those thoughts aside and continued cleaning. When I moved the driver's seat forward to vacuum underneath, something rolled slightly against the floor mat. At first I thought it was a pen. I reached down and picked it up. The moment I saw what it was, my heart seemed to stop. It was a small tube of personal lubricant. For several seconds, I simply stared at it. The world around me became strangely quiet. I turned the tube over in my hand, as if looking at it from another angle might somehow change what it was. But it didn't. There was no confusion, no misunderstanding, and worst of all, there was no explanation that made sense. Richard and I hadn't used anything like that in years. It certainly wasn't something I had purchased. The tube looked relatively new, as though it had been used recently. A cold wave moved through my chest. I sat down in the driver's seat and closed the car door. Suddenly, dozens of moments from the past several months replayed in my mind. The late nights, the unexpected business trips, the secretive phone calls, the excuses, the emotional distance, the way he barely looked at me during dinner anymore. I wanted to cry. I wanted to scream. Most of all, I wanted to confront him immediately and demand answers. But something stopped me. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was exhaustion. Or maybe it was the realization that if Richard was truly hiding something, he would simply lie again. I looked at the tube resting in my palm. For nearly 3 decades, I had stood beside that man through every challenge life had thrown at us. I had supported him when he lost his job. I had cared for him after surgery. I had celebrated every success and comforted every failure. And now I was sitting alone in his car, holding what felt like proof that my trust had been treated as something disposable. A tear rolled down my cheek. I wiped it away before another could follow. No, I wasn't going to cry. Not yet. Carefully, I placed the tube back exactly where I had found it. Then I finished cleaning the car as if nothing had happened. When Richard returned home later that afternoon, he greeted me with his usual smile and asked what was for dinner. I smiled back. For the first time in our marriage, my smile wasn't real. And as I looked into his eyes, I realized something important. I wasn't interested in excuses anymore. I wanted the truth, no matter how ugly it turned out to be. The days that followed felt strangely different, as though I had stepped into a life that looked exactly the same on the surface, but had completely changed underneath. Richard continued his routine as if nothing had happened. Every morning he kissed my cheek before leaving for work. Every evening he sat at the dinner table and asked about my day. To anyone watching, we probably looked like a perfectly ordinary married couple. But I couldn't stop thinking about what I had found in his car. The tube itself wasn't the only thing bothering me anymore. It was what it represented. It was the possibility that every strange behavior over the last several months had been connected to a secret he thought I would never discover. For the first few days, I considered confronting him. Several times I almost did. One evening while we were eating dinner, I looked across the table at him and nearly asked the question burning inside me. Who is she? The words reached the edge of my lips but never came out. Instead, I watched him talk casually about work, sports, and neighborhood gossip as if everything was normal. It amazed me how easily he seemed able to lie. Or perhaps what amazed me most was how long I had failed to see it. As the week passed, I began paying closer attention. Richard spent more time on his phone than ever before. Whenever a message appeared, he glanced at the screen and quickly turned it away from me. One night, I walked into the living room unexpectedly and found him smiling at something on his phone. The moment he noticed me, the smile vanished. He locked the screen immediately. "Everything okay?" I asked. "Just a work message," he replied. His answer came too quickly. I simply nodded and walked away. Inside, however, my doubts continued growing. The next Saturday, Richard announced he needed to leave for another business meeting. That phrase had become one of his favorites recently. A business meeting on a Saturday, another one the following week, then another. I didn't challenge him. Instead, I smiled and wished him a productive day. The look of relief on his face told me more than any confession could have. After he left, I sat alone in the kitchen staring out the window. Part of me felt heartbroken. Another part felt angry. Not the kind of anger that explodes in shouting or arguments. A quieter anger. The kind that grows slowly after trust has been damaged. The kind that develops when someone takes your loyalty for granted. I thought about all the sacrifices I had made during our marriage, the opportunities I had given up, the long hours I worked to support our family, the countless times I put his needs ahead of my own. And yet, somehow, he seemed willing to risk everything we had built together. That realization hurt more than anything. A few days later, while organizing supplies in the garage, my eyes landed on a container of industrial glue left over from an old repair project. I stared at it for several seconds. A strange idea entered my mind. At first, I dismissed it immediately. Then the thought returned. I wasn't interested in causing serious harm. I wasn't interested in violence or destruction. But I was tired of feeling powerless. If Richard wanted to live a secret life, perhaps his secrets deserved a little unexpected complication. The more I thought about it, the more certain I became. Sometimes people become so comfortable with dishonesty that they stop believing consequences exist. Perhaps Richard needed a reminder. The following afternoon, while he was taking a shower, I quietly walked to the garage and retrieved the glue. My hands trembled slightly. Not because I was afraid, because I never imagined I would find myself doing something like this. 28 years of marriage had led to this moment. Carefully, I went to the car. The tube was still exactly where I had found it. I looked around to make sure nobody was watching. Then I made the switch. It took less than a minute. When I finished, I placed everything back exactly as it had been before. No evidence. No clues, nothing out of place. As I closed the car door, my heart pounded harder than it had in years. For a brief moment, guilt tried to creep into my mind. Then I remembered the months of lies, The hidden messages, the secret meetings, the growing distance between us. The guilt disappeared. That evening, Richard came home acting cheerful. He joked during dinner. He talked about future vacation plans. He even reached across the table and squeezed my hand. The gesture felt almost surreal. I smiled politely and played my role perfectly. Meanwhile, a secret of my own sat quietly beneath the driver's seat. And for the first time since discovering his betrayal, I felt calm. I didn't know exactly what would happen next. I didn't know when the truth would finally reveal itself. But one thing was certain. The waiting was almost over. Sooner or later, Richard's carefully constructed world of lies was going to collide with reality. And when it did, there would be no hiding from the consequences. 3 days passed after I replaced the tube. 3 long, quiet days. Richard continued acting as though everything in our marriage was perfectly normal. If anything, he seemed unusually cheerful. He hummed while getting ready for work. He spent extra time looking at himself in the mirror. Once, I even caught him smiling at a text message before quickly hiding his phone when he noticed me watching. I said nothing. The waiting was difficult. Part of me wondered whether my suspicions had been wrong all along. Maybe there was some innocent explanation. Maybe I had overreacted. Then Thursday arrived. It started like any ordinary day. Richard left the house around 6 in the evening wearing a freshly pressed shirt and enough cologne to make it obvious he wasn't heading to any business meeting. "Don't wait up," he said casually while grabbing his car keys. "Big client dinner." I looked up from the book I was pretending to read. A client dinner? Yes. He avoided eye contact. Important opportunity. I smiled politely. Good luck. He seemed relieved by my response. A few moments later, I watched his car disappear down the street. Then I waited. The hours moved slowly. By 9 o'clock, I was sitting in the living room watching television without paying attention to anything on the screen. At 10 o'clock, my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. For a moment, I considered ignoring it. Instead, I answered. "Hello?" A nervous female voice spoke. "Is this Mrs. Walker?" My stomach tightened. "Yes." There was a brief pause. "I think you should know your husband has been taken to the hospital." The room suddenly felt smaller. "What happened?" Another pause. "There's been an accident." The woman sounded embarrassed, uncomfortable, as though she didn't know how to explain. Before I could ask another question, she added quietly, "He's okay, but you should come." Then the call ended. I sat motionless for several seconds. Hospital. Accident. The words echoed through my mind. Despite everything, concern immediately replaced anger. Whatever Richard had done, he was still my husband. I grabbed my purse and drove toward the hospital. When I arrived, the emergency waiting room was unusually busy. After speaking with a receptionist, I was directed toward a treatment area. As I rounded a corner, I spotted Richard sitting in a wheelchair. The sight almost made me stop walking. He looked miserable. His shirt was wrinkled, his face was bright red. Most shocking of all, he refused to look directly at me. Beside him stood a woman I had never seen before. She appeared to be in her 40s and looked equally uncomfortable. The moment she noticed me, she immediately looked away. I didn't need anyone to explain who she was. The truth stood right in front of me. Months of suspicion suddenly became certainty. Richard's secret wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't my imagination. It was real. For a few moments, nobody spoke. The silence was painful. Finally, Richard cleared his throat. "Linda?" I folded my arms. "Client dinner?" His shoulders slumped. The woman quietly excused herself and disappeared down the hallway. Neither of us tried to stop her. A doctor approached a few minutes later. He explained that Richard had suffered an unexpected injury caused by a household product being used improperly. Fortunately, the injury wasn't life-threatening, but it had caused enough complications that emergency medical assistance became necessary. I listened carefully. The doctor remained professional, never discussing unnecessary details. When he finished, Richard looked as though he wanted the floor to open beneath him. Then came the worst part for him. The neighbors already knew something had happened. Apparently, the ambulance had arrived with flashing lights at the apartment complex where the incident occurred. Residents had gathered outside. Questions had been asked. Rumors had started spreading immediately. By the time Richard reached the hospital, half the neighborhood was already talking. His carefully protected secret had become impossible to hide. For years he had managed 2 separate lives. One with me, one hidden in the shadows. Now both worlds had collided. As we sat together in the hospital corridor, I noticed something remarkable. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even surprised. Mostly I felt tired. Tired of the lies. Tired of the excuses. Tired of carrying the weight of a marriage that only one person seemed interested in protecting. Richard finally looked at me. His eyes were filled with shame. "Linda, I can explain." For months I had imagined hearing those words. I thought they would satisfy me. Instead, they sounded meaningless. I stood up slowly and picked up my purse. "No," I said calmly. His expression fell. For the first time, there was no confidence left in him. No excuses. No stories. Only consequences. As I turned and walked toward the exit, I knew something important. The real reckoning wasn't happening in that hospital room. It was waiting for him at home. And by the time the sun rose the next morning, both of our lives would be changed forever. The ride home from the hospital was silent. Not the kind of silence that feels peaceful, but the kind that sits heavily between 2 people who have nothing left to say that won't make things worse. Richard had insisted I stay longer. The doctor had also suggested rest and observation, but I knew him well enough to recognize when he was speaking from pride rather than necessity. He wanted control of the situation. He wanted explanations to fix what could not be undone. I didn't give him either. By the time I reached our house, the night had deepened. The streetlights cast long shadows across the driveway, and everything looked exactly the same as it always had. But I no longer felt like I belonged inside that life. Inside the house, I placed my keys on the table carefully, almost gently. The sound they made against the wood felt louder than usual. For a long moment, I simply stood there. The walls held memories I wasn't sure I wanted anymore. Then I heard the front door open behind me. Richard had come home earlier than expected, leaning slightly on the frame for support. His face looked exhausted, not just physically, but in a way that suggested something deeper had cracked inside him. He didn't speak at first, neither did I. Finally, he broke the silence. "Linda, we need to talk." I turned toward him slowly. "No," I said quietly. The word was not harsh, it was final. He blinked as if he hadn't expected that answer. "I made a mistake," he said quickly. "It wasn't what you think." I held up my hand. "Stop." He fell silent immediately. For the first time in years, Richard looked uncertain in his own home. The confidence he used to carry like armor was gone, replaced by something much more fragile. "I already know enough," I continued. "More than enough." His jaw tightened. "I didn't want to hurt you." That line. That familiar line people use when they've already done damage and hope intention can erase consequence. I walked past him toward the living room. He followed slowly, as if unsure whether he was allowed to. On the coffee table sat a framed photograph of us from years ago. We were younger, smiling without effort, standing close like nothing in the world could separate us. I picked it up and looked at it for a long time. Then I gently turned it face down. Richard watched me. "Are you leaving me?" he asked, voice low. I didn't answer immediately. Not because I was confused, but because I finally understood something important. Leaving isn't always an explosion. Sometimes it's a quiet realization that the place you once called home has already changed into something unfamiliar. I stayed longer than I should have, I said at last. His eyes softened slightly, almost pleading. We can fix this. I shook my head. No, you can't fix what you never protected. The room went still again. Outside, a dog barked in the distance. A car passed slowly down the street. Life continued, as if nothing important was ending inside this house. I walked toward the hallway and paused for a moment. This isn't about one mistake, I added. It's about every time you looked me in the eyes and chose a lie instead of the truth. He said nothing, because there was nothing left that could undo it. I went into the bedroom and opened the closet. I didn't rush. I didn't cry. I simply started packing a small bag. Nothing dramatic, nothing symbolic, just essentials. When I returned to the living room, Richard was sitting on the sofa, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor like a man trying to understand how everything had slipped away without him noticing. I never wanted it to end like this, he whispered. I stopped near the door. Neither did I replied softly. And that was the most honest thing either of us had said in a long time. I stepped outside into the cool night air. The door closed behind me without force, without anger, just finality. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was waiting for explanations. I wasn't waiting for anything anymore. As I walked down the driveway, I realized something I hadn't expected. What had broken me wasn't the betrayal itself. It was the moment I stopped believing I needed him to define my life. And with that realization, I didn't feel empty. I felt free.